My name is Henry Coles, and if you had told me 6 months ago that my Corgi, Arthur, would be responsible for the dramatic rescue of a squirrel from a London sewer grate, I would have laughed politely and offered you a cup of tea. I've lived in London for over 30 years, worked in publishing most of that time, and Arthur has been my faithful companion for a little over 5 years now. He's got the classic Corgi frame, short legs, barrel body, with ears like satellite dishes and the gait of a well-fed fox. We live in Richmond, right near the park, in a modest 2-bedroom flat just off Sheen Road. Arthur's known by nearly everyone on our street, not because I'm particularly social, but because he's got this odd habit of greeting people with a short bark and a sneeze, as if he's issuing a blessing. He's clever too, not just in the he knows how to sit way, but clever in that he notices things I don't. He's helped me find my keys 3 times this year, just by sniffing out wherever I've left them. Still, even with all that, I didn't expect what happened on that rainy Wednesday morning in October. It had been raining steadily for 2 days, not uncommon for London, but enough to make the roads slick and the park paths sludgy. I'd delayed our morning walk until around 10 a.m., hoping for a break in the downpour. When it finally eased up into a light drizzle, I grabbed Arthur's lead and we made our way down the lane toward Richmond Green. Usually, our route is fairly predictable, through the narrow alley between the pharmacy and the bakery, past the post box, and then a big loop around the green itself before cutting back through the high street. Arthur trots just ahead of me most of the time, leash loose, tail wagging, always alert. That day, however, something was different. As we neared the northeast corner of the green, Arthur suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Not like him at all. He just froze, ears pinned back, tail stiff. I thought maybe he'd seen another dog or smelled a fox, but when I tried to coax him forward, he gave a low, sustained whine. I bent down to his level and tried to check his paws, thinking maybe he'd stepped on something sharp, but he shook me off, tugged hard left, and began pulling me toward the sidewalk grate near the edge of the path. I followed reluctantly. The area wasn't unusual, it was the kind of spot you'd pass 100 times without noticing. A square iron grate, slightly sunken, with a cluster of fallen leaves swirling around it. Arthur stood above the grate, nose twitching, then let out a sharp, insistent bark. He paced in a tight circle, then lay down flat against the pavement, peering directly into the metal grid. At this point, I leaned over to take a look myself. At first, I didn't see anything. Just darkness and a faint glimmer of water below. But Arthur kept barking, 3 short barks, then silence, then 3 more. It wasn't until I moved a few inches to the left that I saw it. A tiny pair of eyes staring up at me from the shadows. Blinking, trembling. It was a squirrel. At first, I assumed it was dead. It was lying on its side, motionless, partially submerged in the shallow runoff below the grate. But then it blinked again and moved its front paw, just a slight twitch, but enough to confirm it was alive. The rainwater had pooled in the base of the drain, and the squirrel looked soaked through, fur plastered against its body, tail matted and limp. I remember this jolt of adrenaline flooding through me, not panic exactly, but a sudden, overwhelming urgency. I reached for my phone to call the local RSPCA branch, but the signal was poor, and the drizzle had turned into something heavier. I pulled Arthur back on his leash and tied him to the nearby bench, then dropped to my knees beside the grate again. The squirrel didn't move much, but it was clearly alive, and clearly trapped. The openings in the grate were too narrow for it to climb out, and the wet surface gave it no grip. It must have fallen in sometime during the night or early morning. My best guess was that the rain had flushed it from its nest, and in its panic, it tumbled through the leaves and into the open grate. It occurred to me that time mattered. The temperature had dropped the night before, and the squirrel's tiny body must have been fighting to keep warm. Hypothermia was a real risk. I glanced around, hoping for a council worker or even a groundskeeper, someone with the authority and tools to open the grate, but the park was near empty. Just an older couple in raincoats walking on the far side of the green. I tried the council's emergency number, but it went to voicemail. Then I remembered a friend of mine, Rima, who works for the borough in the infrastructure department. I called her. She picked up on the second ring. "Henry, everything all right?" "Rima, listen. I know this sounds mad, but there's a squirrel trapped in a sewer grate on Richmond Green. It's alive, just barely. I don't know what to do. To her credit, she didn't laugh. All right, where exactly? I gave her the details, and she promised to make a few calls. In the meantime, I stayed kneeling beside the grate, pulling off my jacket and draping it like a canopy to block the rain. Arthur sat next to me, uncharacteristically still, his nose twitching and his ears flicking at the sound of the squirrel's occasional squeaks. It took nearly 20 minutes for anyone to arrive. First came a council van with 2 workers, Paul and Ed, their names stitched on their uniforms. They brought tools and a portable heater. Then came a volunteer from a local wildlife charity, a woman named Mia, with a blue blanket and a small animal carrier. They worked carefully, unscrewing the grate, gently lifting it off without startling the squirrel. Arthur watched the whole process intently, as if supervising. When the grate was finally removed, Mia reached in with gloved hands. The squirrel made a weak attempt to back away, but it had no strength left to resist. She cradled it gently, wrapping it in the blanket and placing it inside the carrier. The relief in that moment was profound, like watching a breath you didn't realize you were holding finally exhale. Paul, one of the council workers, turned to me and said, "You said your dog found it?" I nodded, looking down at Arthur. Wouldn't have noticed otherwise. He wouldn't leave it alone. Paul chuckled. Smart dog. Arthur sneezed. I didn't realize until much later that the story would make its rounds, not just among our neighbors, but in local news outlets and even a segment on BBC London. They called it, "The Corgi Who Saved a Squirrel." I wasn't looking for recognition, but the attention did bring light to a problem we hadn't considered: how animals, especially small ones, can get trapped during storms in the city's storm drain systems. As for the squirrel, we later learned from Mia that it survived, fully recovered after a week at a local wildlife center. They released it back into the same area, where it promptly disappeared into the trees like nothing had happened. But that was only the beginning. What I didn't know at the time, what I couldn't have known, was that this one rescue would lead to something much bigger. Not just more animals, but something that would eventually involve the community, the council, and even environmental planning in our part of London. But I'll get to that. For now, that's how it all began, with a corgi who wouldn't stop barking at a grate on a rainy Wednesday morning. After the squirrel rescue, I honestly thought things would quiet down. Arthur went back to his usual habits, begging for biscuits at the corner shop, barking at buses, and snoozing on the living room rug like none of it had ever happened. I went back to work, answering a few emails from people who'd read the local article or seen the BBC clip, mostly just kind messages and the odd question about how to train a squirrel-sensing dog. But something stuck with me. A few days after the rescue, I was walking Arthur past the same grate when I noticed how many leaves had already gathered around it again. It was blocked halfway across. It occurred to me that if it had rained like that again, if another animal had fallen in, we might not have been lucky a second time. So I called the council, not to complain, just to ask what protocols were in place for keeping storm grates clear, especially near the park. The man on the other end, to his credit, took it seriously. We spoke for a good 15 minutes. He admitted they didn't have an active checklist specific to animal safety. They cleared grates when reported blocked, but there wasn't an inspection routine dedicated to spotting risks to wildlife. Frankly, why would there have been? Until Arthur found that squirrel, no one had even considered it. I told him what happened, not just the details, but how unlikely it all was. How Arthur had known something was wrong, how no one else had noticed. That's when he said something that surprised me. "You ought to talk to Dr. Fiona Howard at King's College. She runs a program on urban animal behavior. Something about canines identifying ecological anomalies." I laughed at the phrasing. Ecological anomalies? You mean squirrels in drains? Exactly. Out of curiosity, I sent Dr. Howard an email. I explained the situation and expected either no reply or a short thank you. Instead, I got a reply within 3 hours. She was fascinated, and not just with Arthur. She invited me and Arthur to come in for an informal observation session. I brought him the following week. She and 2 grad students set up a series of mock urban hazards, small grates, pipes, and boxes, with recordings of animal distress calls played very faintly from a few of them. The idea wasn't to test Arthur like a laboratory rat but to observe whether his reaction to the squirrel had been instinctual or something he could repeat. And sure enough, he honed in on the distress grate every single time. Not just once or twice, every time. He sniffed, stopped, barked, and laid down just as he had that day in Richmond Green. Dr. Howard looked at me after the session and said, "This dog has something you don't train into them. He pays attention to things most humans ignore." That meeting ended up leading to something I never anticipated. Arthur and I were invited to assist in a small pilot study mapping urban wildlife entrapment hazards in southwest London. The idea was simple. We'd take walks along predetermined routes, many of them in Richmond, Twickenham, and Kingston, and log any signs of small animal hazards. Grates, pipes, overgrown hedges, partially blocked sewer covers. Arthur would act naturally, and I'd record anything unusual he reacted to. It started as a 2-week study. But word spread. By the 3rd week, we were joined by 3 more volunteers with dogs. None of the other dogs responded quite the way Arthur did, but the mapping began to form a clear picture. Urban infrastructure, especially in green bordering residential areas, was riddled with microhazards, openings too small or hidden for people to notice, but dangerous for wildlife. Arthur detected 2 more cases during that first month. One was a starling trapped inside a partially covered ventilation shaft behind a school near Mortlake. The second was a young hedgehog wedged inside a storm drain near a bus stop in Kew. Both animals were rescued. Both made the news in small but significant ways. And by now, Arthur's photo had become something of a fixture, tongue out, ears up, the unofficial mascot of the project. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late November, cold, damp, the sky like grey slate. Arthur and I were walking the edge of Old Deer Park near the Thames. It was quiet, a weekday afternoon. We were nearing the edge of the cricket grounds when Arthur stopped dead again. This time, I knew the look in his eye. He was alert, not frightened, not confused. Just intensely focused. I followed his gaze and saw it, another grate, square and sunken, half covered with dead leaves. He approached it cautiously, then barked once and sat beside it. I dropped to my knees again and peered inside. What I saw turned my stomach. It wasn't an animal this time. It was a mess of shredded plastic, old food wrappers, broken glass, and a thick black sludge choking the drain's base. No animal in sight, but it was clear something had been here. More than just leaves or runoff. This wasn't storm debris. It looked more like illegal dumping, possibly oil or some kind of chemical waste. I took photos and flagged the location in our mapping app. Then I called Rima from the council again. She arrived an hour later with a colleague from the environment department. They confirmed the worst. Someone had been dumping used cooking oil and other kitchen waste down nearby back alley drains. The blockages weren't just dangerous to wildlife. They were a massive risk to flooding and pollution in the local river tributaries. Over the next few weeks, the council issued formal investigations. Arthur's discovery kicked off a city-level conversation about drain surveillance, wildlife access points, and illegal waste disposal. We ended up attending a public forum in December, where I spoke about what we'd found, not as a scientist or activist, just a man who walked his dog. And Arthur? He sat beside me the whole time, wearing a little high-vis vest they'd made him, with the words, "Wildlife Watchdog," printed on the back. By January, the project had expanded. Local councils in adjacent boroughs asked for copies of our drain and hazard maps. Schools invited us to speak to students about wildlife safety and environmental care. And Arthur's nose was added as an honorary detection tool in the borough's ecological field reports. A few weeks ago, we were out again, this time with a group of volunteers, walking part of the towpath by Teddington Lock. Arthur stopped at a grate, sniffed, barked, then turned in a circle and looked back at me. I smiled. It was just leaves this time. No squirrel, no oil, just Arthur, doing what he does, paying attention. People often ask me if Arthur was trained for this. The truth is no. He's just a corgi with a good nose, an instinct for noticing what doesn't belong, and a stubborn streak that won't quit until someone listens. And thankfully, on that rainy morning in October, I did. Sometimes I still walk past that first grate on Richmond Green. It's got a new cover now, raised edges, smaller holes, better drainage. There's even a small plaque nearby. It says, "To Arthur the Corgi, who noticed." October 2024. Every time I read it, I smile. Because in a city filled with noise and movement and constant distraction, one small dog reminded us all that sometimes, the most important things are the ones just below the surface.